Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, today hosted by our friends at the Idea Stream Center. I'm Homer Taft, a member of the City Club, and I'm pleased to welcome to the City Club today the President of the Ohio Senate, Keith Faber. Today, at Cleveland Citadel of Free Speech, Senate President Faber will discuss consideration of Ohio's biennial budget, which is presently before the Senate. In February of 2013, Governor Kasich proposed a budget that included many major changes and innovations, including a new formula for educational funding, Medicaid expansion in line with the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, revisions of funding for higher education, a new tax reform, including new severance taxes on oil and gas, expansion of the taxable base for the sales tax, and an across-the-board income tax rate reduction, as well as a credit on small business income. The Ohio House of Representatives recently passed their version of Ohio's biennial budget. Many changes were proposed from the governor's budget, including dropping the sales tax expansion and the severance tax rates and the small income business credit. They also deferred decisions on the Medicaid expansion and it adopted a very different educational funding formula. Now the Ohio Senate is working on the budget and many amendments are being discussed. Some amendments will probably be adopted, likely resulting in a conference between the House and the Senate before the bill can be placed before the governor for his action. The budget must be reached and enacted by June 30th. Senator Keith Faber, as the Senate's presiding officer, has considerable responsibility in guiding the budget through both the committee and Senate consideration and trying to craft a budget generally acceptable to senators. Senator Faber was elected President of the Senate in this year, January, and elected to the Senate in 2006. He chairs the Rules Committee and has served during his terms in the Senate on many committees, including, importantly, the Budget Writing, Finance, and Financial Institutions Committees. Before his election to the Senate, he served 3 terms in the Ohio House of Representatives. Senator Faber lives in Salina, Ohio, in Mercer County, with his wife and 2 children, where he practices law in his spare time. He received his law degree from The Ohio State University, his undergraduate degree from Oakland University. Will you please join me in welcoming to the City Club of Cleveland, Senator Keith Faber.
Thank you. It is a true pleasure to be here, Homer, and thank you so much for the introduction. I want to thank you for the City Club for inviting me to be here. It is truly an honor to speak at the oldest continuous free speech forum in the country. It's even more of an honor for me to be here in Cleveland. I bring you greetings from the other lakefront community that starts with a C, Salina. We sit on the banks of Grand Lake St. Mary's. Not exactly Lake Erie, but we try. Let me also recognize one of the finest public servants, or actually group of public servants, that I've ever had the pleasure to serve with. I'm here with 2 members of my leadership team, Senator Tom Patton, who is our majority leader, Senator Larry Obhoff, who is our majority whip, and also Senator John Eklund, who is chairman of our Criminal Justice Committee. These 3 gentlemen do yeoman's work for Northeast Ohio, and are frankly I'm honored to have the privilege of serving with them. Both of them, all 3 of them actually, have had opportunities to make a difference here in Ohio, and you see that every single day. As I mentioned, I am from Salina. Salina is way over in Mercer County, which is on the far left side of the state, just 12 miles from Indiana. Now that might be the only time you ever hear anybody say Mercer County is to the left of anywhere in Ohio. Let me put it in perspective for you. Here in Cuyahoga County, Barack Obama, President Obama, won with 69% of the vote. Mercer County voted 77% of the vote for Mitt Romney. So it's real tough to say that you could be on farther bookends for Ohio than Salina and Cuyahoga County. But you know what? It's that diversity that makes Ohio great. We have great cities that begin with a C: Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Salina, Chillicothe. And we can work through cities that begin with other letters. And when we work through Ohio, we end up finding a state that represents the nation and has a great deal of diversity, which makes up our strength. You know, you didn't come here necessarily for me to talk about me, but I think it's probably appropriate, since most of you probably haven't met me before today, to give you a little bit of an introduction. I am the youngest of 4 brothers and sisters. My mom and dad were divorced when I turned 6. Mom was a nurse, Dad was a cop. We always had to learn the value of hard work in our family. I can remember Mom working overtime as a nurse, so we'd have nice Christmas and birthday presents. At 12, I had the opportunity to get my first paycheck job. I was a janitor at Culligan Water Conditioning. I can remember riding my moped to Culligan Water Conditioning to clean their toilets and sweep their floors. And in that experience, I saw the salespeople who were paid on commission. And in those commissions, the harder they worked, the more they sold, the more they got to make. That was a great experience in hard work. Just a few years later, I had the opportunity to help a couple who literally mortgaged their house to open a pizza parlor. They literally were trying to take their American entrepreneurial dream and make it a success. And I saw every Friday as they counted the till to see whether they'd made it or not. Then a couple of years after that, I went to work for that great American icon, McDonald's. You know, where you learn if you have time to lean, you have time to clean. I see some of you probably had similar experiences. Fast forward, I was the very first one of my family to go to college. The very first one. And I worked my way through college, even though I was fortunate to have some scholarships. But that and through law school, I further learned that with opportunity and hard work, you can do anything you want in this land of opportunity that is Ohio. That's my benchmark. I had the opportunity after graduating law school and practicing in Indiana for a while to come back to Ohio and go to work for a company, to where again I had the opportunity to find riches and prosperity in the way of meeting my wife Andrea, who is currently a doctoral candidate and working on her PhD. But meeting Andrea and working together at a company, and that's the riches and opportunity that I'm talking to you about, I learned that Ohio has other great things to give. And from that, I now have a 8-year-old and a 6-year-old son and daughter. And so most of you are asking the question, why would a small-town country lawyer have the opportunity to go to work in the Senate and become Senate President? Well, from my experience, it's pretty simple. It's about hard work, and it's about opportunity, and it's about the gifts that Ohio has to give. But my focus, and John Eklund's focus, and Tom Patton's focus, and Larry Obhoff's focus, each and every day in the state Senate, it's not so much about ourselves. It's about our kids and grandkids. And it's the same reason all of you are here today. It's the same reason you are putting a focus on public policy. It's about how we can make Ohio a better place to live, work, and raise our families into the future. You know, from that perspective, I have the pleasure as Senate President to sit right above, my office is right above, the room where Abraham Lincoln was told he'd won the American presidency. So every day as I sit in that office, I think about the heritage that we have as a state legislature. And in fact, it was Lincoln's speech to a group of Ohio soldiers in 1864 where he said, a very important quote, "It is not merely for today, but for all time to come, that we should perpetuate for our children's children this great and free government, which we have enjoyed all of our lives." It is that great and free government that we are here to talk about and promote in state government and in a national government. You know, we have a lot of work to do in Ohio. And while I am proud to tell you that we have been successfully changing the way state government works, and in many ways we can celebrate successes that we are doing better, but as I tell my colleagues every single day, better is still not good enough for Ohio. Let's just talk about where we were and where we've come to. 3 years ago, Ohio faced an $8 billion budget deficit. $8 billion. Everybody around Cap Square came to us and said, what taxes are you going to raise to solve this problem? How are you going to get out of it? Everybody knew that we were in trouble. Our unemployment rate had reached double digits. We were above the national average. We'd lost hundreds of thousands of jobs. Businesses all across Ohio were leaving in droves. Our credit outlook had been lowered. Our taxes had gone up. Home foreclosures had hit a record high. The list goes on. As they say, though, that was then, and now is now. Where are we today? In less than 2 years, we eliminated that budget shortfall. You remember those taxes I talked about that everybody knew we were going to raise? Well, we not only didn't raise them, we actually allowed a personal income tax cut of $800 million to go into effect. We killed Ohio's job-killing death tax. We lowered property taxes, and we completely overhauled Ohio's job-creating programs with Jobs Ohio. We also saw recognition of unemployment going down. We went from being above the national average to below the national average. We went back into single digits. In fact, Ohio businesses to date have created more than 110,000 new Ohio jobs. That's a record, especially when you compare that just a couple of years ago. Just a couple of years ago, Ohio was losing over 100,000 jobs a year. Yes, we're doing better. And in fact, a new survey of CEOs nationwide touted Ohio jumping 13 places, making Ohio one of the best states to do business. In fact, we're up 22 places since just 2010, and now Ohio ranks first in the nation of the rate of improvement on places to do business. Ohio is once again being talked globally and nationally as a place that you can come do business. And let me tell you just one anecdotal story about that. It was not too long ago, I was going to say a couple months, but it's been a little longer than that now. I was on a plane flying back from visiting family. And on the flight back from Atlanta to Columbus, I sat next to a gentleman. And after we had our conversation, you know, the conversation you always have with seatmates in an airplane, like who you are, what you do. After I had that conversation, the gentleman turned to me. And he said, "Keith, I don't know what you guys are doing in Ohio, but you got to keep doing it. Just a couple of years ago, Ohio was not in our future plans for expanding our business. In fact, we were talking about closing down our Ohio operations. But I'm literally on this airplane right now to go look for new space for our business to expand and grow in Ohio. Something's changed. Ohio's back in play." You know, that story can be repeated time and time and time again. And it's reflected in those 110,000 new jobs that we're seeing in Ohio. We're expanding. Whether it's energy development in the south and southeastern part of this state, or whether it's biotech and our hospital medical corridor, or whether it's our universities and the spin-offs that we're starting to see from our fine educational institutions. Something's happening in Ohio, and I'm excited about it. But you know, government, while I don't believe government creates jobs, government does help create that environment where jobs and job creators can flourish. Let me just give you some of the other ways we've done that. We've streamlined regulations in Ohio, which has certainly made a difference. In fact, regulatory filings in Ohio are down 42%. Contrast that with the fact that we've had over 88,000 new business filings in Ohio, a state record. We've never had that many before. That's a huge improvement. You know, I joined Governor Kasich last week alone to announce a $1 billion workers' compensation rebate to Ohio small businesses and businesses all across the state. Coupled with the second part of that program, to where we're talking about actually doing a forward change in our rating structure that will result in another $600 to $800 million cut for Ohio employers. That's real incentives, and that's going to help grow real jobs. You know, thanks to Northeast Ohio senators like Tom Patton and Gail Manning, we just delivered a transportation budget. A budget which puts Northern Ohio road projects first by guaranteeing that 90% of the $1.5 billion turnpike bond issuance will be used to fund Northern Ohio roads. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, while Congress is dysfunctional, getting poll ratings literally lower than head lice and colonoscopies, state government's working. The bottom line is clear. You can govern successfully on conservative principles, and you can still reach across the aisle to get things done. Let's just talk about that for a second. Everybody thinks that state government works like Congress. We don't, and I'm thankful for it. In fact, so far this year in the Senate, we've passed roughly 20 bills out of the Senate. four have been sponsored by Democrats, either as a primary sponsor or the lead co-sponsor. 13 have had Democrat co-sponsorship on down on the list, and 95% of the bills we passed out of the Senate this year, Senate bills, have had bipartisan votes. That's a record that Congress could only dream about. Our rebuilding has to continue. You see, we haven't tapped all of Ohio's potential. We are transforming Ohio, and Ohioans are starting to notice. In fact, the approval rating for legislatures, that's the guys that I'm talking about here earlier, is at a 5-year high. The governor needs to take credit for part of this. He has pushed a bold agenda. He has been laser focused on job creation and economic growth. That is worthy of recognizing. I also want to compliment our friends in the House, Speaker Batchelder, and our colleagues over there, because the legislature works together for a change. That's how decisions are made at the State House. And the reason that in state government with this budget, we can be having bold discussions, like, are we going to use a tax cut for small businesses? Are we going to give all Ohioans a 7% across-the-board income tax cut? Are discussions that were literally unthinkable just a couple of years ago. So when I talk about us doing better, you have an idea of what I'm talking about. Our discussion now, however, is where do we go from here? Because as I said, better still isn't good enough. In the Senate, we have been laser focused on job creation and economic development. If you look at what we've been doing, our Senate Bill 1 and all of the other bills we've been passing have been focused on things that will grow jobs and strengthen the economy. And that's where we're going to go with this budget. So let me just talk about some of the big items that you've heard about in this year's budget. First, Medicaid. The House has indicated simply that they don't have the votes to get Medicaid reform done as part of the budget. So we agreed, working with the House and the governor, to set aside Medicaid reform and do it outside the budget as a separate bill. We are looking for some very clear things in Medicaid reform. First, we've announced the creation to accomplish this by a task force made up of House and Senate members, along with the governor's folks, to try and focus on reform as the key to Medicaid issues. First, you have to recognize as part of that Medicaid has a significant financial impact on the state. It's 40% of the state budget. 40%. And we need to understand all of the intended and unintended consequences of changing our Medicaid system. I've asked Dave Burke from the Senate, who chairs our State Government Oversight Committee, and our resident pharmacist, to work on this with the House and in a bipartisan fashion. But let me be clear. Any Medicaid proposal in the Senate has to include flexibility. It has to ask the federal government to allow us flexibility in designing a system that works for Ohio. And that must include performance measures, it must include cost measures, and it also must allow individuals to be targeted into a system that works best for them. From that perspective, we believe in things like community-based health centers. We believe in things that are going to try and target reforms and funding into places to where individuals can get responses. Let me just give you an example. I was speaking to the Ohio State Medical Association not too long ago, and one of the issues they brought up was Medicaid reform. And I asked this question: how many of you would design a health care program for the poor like the current Medicaid system? Not a single hand went up. Then I asked, how many of you would like to have a health care program which tied compliance to doctors and medical professionals' requests as a key component? Almost every hand went up. You see, our current system doesn't tie those two things together. Any system that we come out with from reform needs to look at compliance, accessibility, and frankly, affordability as part of the components. I don't know a single one of my colleagues in the Senate, not one, who doesn't believe Medicaid reform is appropriate and who doesn't want to provide care for those who need it most. Not one. However, what that means is the key for Ohio going forward in the future, because we are all very concerned about the long-term viability of any changes that we might do in a Medicaid reform package now. School funding. Finally, we are working every single day to look at a new way to fund Ohio schools. And I say finally, because I came to the legislature now 12 years ago. School funding is always an issue. If you talk to State House historians, it was an issue in 1803, I think, when the state was founded. It has always been an issue, and the reality is there are a lot of good ideas, but what works in Cleveland may not work in Salina, and what works in Salina may not work in Columbus. And that's the problem, is one-size-fits-all solutions. You know, in Ohio, we've had an attempt to try and do one-size-fits-all solutions. Maybe it's time we go back and allow more local control and more deviation as to what works in each community using an individual model. Now, from a funding perspective, we are looking at options that work for Ohio students. Let me repeat that. We're looking at options that work for Ohio students. For too long, school funding has been based on institutions and buildings and what works for the adults. We're going to try and figure out what works for the kids. I would suggest that we want to continue to build on the third grade reading guarantee and make sure it's implemented successfully. I would suggest that we want to make sure that funding gets to the classroom and to the students where it's most effective. We'll have more to say specifics about our school funding plan, but my colleagues right now are working to try and put together our face on the K-12 plan that was introduced by the governor, that was modified by the House, and will be perfected by the Senate. I said this the other day to the speaker. The governor introduced something that was good. The House made it a little better. By the time it comes out of the Senate, it will be well reasoned. Now, the reality is we have a way to look at this. The higher education funding model is a good example of how things can get done if you have people in the right room that want to find solutions. The governor asked higher education and the entire community to come together in a work group headed by Dr. Gee of Ohio State. That group came together and put together a proposal which I think is going to pass virtually unchanged through the legislature. It essentially does something that's revolutionary in education. It rewards success. It pays for course graduation and it pays for college graduation, not just merely putting bodies in chairs. That's a remarkable transformation in the way we do education. And it happened by letting the experts, the people on the ground, cultivate a solution that will work for all of Ohio. That's the same model that we try and approach difficult problems with in the Senate. You know, at the outset of my remarks, I mentioned that while we've made progress, it's not good enough. Doing better, finalizing this race towards making Ohio a great place to work, live, and raise our families will not be easy. You have people out there on both sides of the aisle who are willing to put aside differences and make it work. I am always pleased when I see my Democrat colleagues step up and say, hey, this isn't exactly the way I'd have done it, but it's still moving the ball in the right direction, so I'm going to vote for it. However, you also have people out there who get paid to see us fail. I call them the naysayers of negativity. Maybe you've heard that term before. The reality is they have a vested interest in conflict. Ignore them. If you don't bring solutions to the table, you're not going to have a very effective seat at the table. That's our challenge. You know, as we head into this election year, and it's fair to say that people will start to choose sides, they're going to start to point political fingers. They're going to say we need to win campaigns. It reminds me of a story Ronald Reagan used to tell. He told the story about the farmer and the lawyer who got into a pretty bad car accident one day. Maybe you've heard this. Since I'm a lawyer who represents a lot of farmers, I can probably tell it and get away with it. Anyway, at the car accident scene, the lawyer looked at the farmer and they were both hurt. So the farmer went back to his car and got out a package. And the package contained a bottle. And the farmer came to the lawyer and handed the bottle to him and said, "You look pretty pale. You look pretty worse for the wear. Why don't you take a swig and ease your nerves a little bit?" So the lawyer, he took a swig and said, "That isn't bad." He took another swig and After a couple more swigs, he said his nerves were starting to calm out a little bit. And he turned back to the farmer and passed the bottle back and said to the farmer, "Don't you want to have a belt too?" And the farmer said, "No, I'm sitting here waiting for the state trooper to arrive." You know, that's how Republicans and Democrats sometimes tend to act towards each other, particularly when election season rolls around. But in the meantime, Ohio needs leadership. And it's that leadership that I challenge my Democrat friends and my Republican friends to step up to the table and join us in. When the dust settles, we still have a lot of work to do. We all need to work together. We can get there. We can solve Ohio's pressing problems, but it won't happen overnight. It won't happen without hard work, and it won't happen unless, regardless of our differences, we share the goal of Abraham Lincoln to perpetuate for our children and our children's children this great and free government which we have enjoyed all of our lives. Thank you for inviting me here to the club to speak. Thank you for your kind hospitality. And thank you for working with me on both sides of the aisle to help find solutions that work for your children and my children and our grandchildren. God bless you all.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're listening to a special program featuring Ohio Senate President Keith Faber on consideration of Ohio's biennial budget reported from the House of Representatives and currently before the Ohio Senate. We will return to our speaker momentarily for our traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate your questions for our speaker now and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here today, especially those of you who are guests. Having entered our second century, we invite all of you to join the City Club, become active in our ongoing civic dialogue, and support our citadel of free speech. We are pleased to welcome today guests at tables hosted by Cuyahoga Community College, the Cuyahoga County Republican Party, and University Hospitals. Thank you for your support. We would also like to thank IdeaStream for hosting us today. Now we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answers. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are our program director, Carrie Miller, and Mike Grimaldi, our development associate. First question, please.
Thank you, President, for your talk. You mentioned the job-killing death tax, which is also known as a 2% tax on inheritances of $750,000 and up. And I'm a city councilman in South Euclid, just east of Cleveland, where we're facing really tough cuts of our safety forces, police and fire, and I know your father was a policeman. What do we tell our constituents with the municipal government fund not being fully funded, and where people who are inheriting, we don't have many people inheriting $750,000, but we do have people who pay their income tax. And what do we tell them tonight and in 2 weeks when we finalize our budget, where we have to make a tough decision about either cutting police and safety or raising local income taxes in a situation like that? How do I report back to my constituents that I saw you and you said, well, we killed the job-killing death tax, but you know, we still have to raise your income tax or cut police force?
Great question. Thank you for that question. The question is I will take it more generally than just because you mentioned you really don't get any estate tax revenue because not many people have that income in your community. More about the local government funds and revenue sharing. In general, I would say that the reason we eliminated the death tax, the Ohio's estate tax, was to grow jobs and strengthen the economy. We're seeing that happen. There were individuals who would have left your community that would not have paid your community income tax to move to Florida or other states, and that this should help grow and strengthen that as well. But candidly, all government in Ohio has to figure out how to work harder and smarter. And I'm not saying your community doesn't. We've all had sacrifices. In the last budget, we cut nearly 18% of state government. And part of that was an adjustment to our revenue sharing, which at the time for local communities was less than 3 or 4% of their total local government's budgets, because most of the money doesn't come from the local government funds. But we know that was a sacrifice. And one of the things that we would encourage you to work with and work with us is to tell us what we can do as state legislators and as state government to make your world operate easier and to retake some of your local government control and give us some of that regulatory flexibility. The same encouragement that we offer other businesses when you tell us what we need to do, how we can help you get to that place without necessarily money, because money's tight everywhere in state government. And one of the reasons we've seen some of that resurrection in job growth is because we're trying to be fiscally responsible. And I'm sure your community is doing the same thing. And so those are tough decisions for local government folks, and I thank you for doing that service.
I'll follow up.
Sure.
Hi, thanks. Scott Lynch. I'm a Euclid City Councilman, and I'm also just finishing my law degree down the road at the Fine Institution at Cleveland Marshall College of Law. An appropriate follow-up question that my real concern is for the state of the home rule powers of home rule cities in the state of Ohio. And what we've seen from the significant cuts to local government fund, but also, frankly, just the changes of the global economy, devaluation in property taxes, is that local governments and the small communities as they exist no longer really have the power to control their own destiny, which was really the hallmark of home rule. We've heard a lot of talk over the last few years about shared services and ways for local governments to do things more efficiently, but frankly they've been too small scale. They haven't really been regionalism, they've more been neighborism, talking just to the folks next door. And just talking to the folks next door doesn't necessarily make the region of, say, Cuyahoga County much more efficient and hopeful that we'll be able to do things better, because really every dollar wasted in repeat municipal entities is dollars that could be reinvested in our community. So my question is that State Representative Schuring just this session had the idea of highly incentivizing issues such as shared services and perhaps even mergers that need to happen at a much faster pace and a much larger economy of scale for us to really, again, start controlling our own destiny as municipal government. So would the Senate be willing to take up a similar measure to incentivize these moves much more aggressively? And are there other considerations you'd have for really addressing the infrastructure problem? Because cities just only talking to the folks next door, at least for 2 or 2.5 years, hasn't really been able to solve our problem.
Another great question, and thank you for your service in local government as well. I had the good fortune when I was about your position as a law student, working in a city attorney's office, and got very familiar with the home rule constitutional sections and drafted a number of opinions on it. And so we believe in home rule in this state. And from that perspective, I think you're asking the question from the right perspective. What can we do to empower you and other local governments to take back control of their destiny? And frankly, we're asking you for that information. I think that's going to be a far better solution that comes from local government to the state than from the state back to local government. Because again, we tend to work in things one-size-fits-all solutions. And what works in your community may not work in another community around the state. And so we're looking for those incentives and that information that will work to do partnerships across regional boundaries. One of the things we did was on the communication side, on the PSAPs, which are the Public Safety Answering Centers, and tried to consolidate those and get rid of a number of those that were overlapping and costing communities a lot of money to operate duplicative PSAPs all around the area. A number of communities have participated in that consolidation effort that we're helping to fund. The other thing we did on the Local Government Incentive Fund was to try and incentivize and pay for opportunities for that collaboration. And if we need to go broader and even go extra county, that's something that we would be willing to consider. So if you have ideas, work with your fellow council around the state and frankly also in your own communities, and send those to your local representatives or senators, and we're happy to consider those, because I think the best answer to that is going to come from you, not me telling you what you need to do.
Good afternoon, Senator. Thank you for coming. We've heard you talk earlier about education, and as the owner of a growing manufacturing company, we're all concerned about how we gain the talent, not just from the four-year schools, but from the trade schools, from the high schools, for manufacturing, for skilled labor that we can use to grow our businesses. Can you address that question?
Great question. Thank you. I had the pleasure of sitting down about a month ago with a bunch of employers like you in my district, and we sat around the table and I asked them, what's it going to take? And most of them said, we've got jobs. We've got jobs right now. In fact, there's 100,000 jobs in Ohio Means Jobs that are unfilled. 100,000. And so the key is how do we provide the training to get those folks into those chairs? And I'll just give you one example. In my area, it's welding. We need welders. We found out that there just weren't a whole lot of programs that were targeting people to give those welding skills. And so we developed a partnership with one of our job training career centers that would work with the employer to train current employees that they had in welding trades and get their experience level up. You know, it's not very expensive, but you have to have the partnership with the employers for the jobs and the training centers. So that's one way. But let me talk about the one I'm really proud about, and that's SB 1, the number one priority bill for the Senate. That's our Workforce Training Revolving Loan Fund. We took $25 million from the casinos. Okay, they put this money in for workforce training. We took $25 million of that and set it aside to create a revolving loan fund, a program for communities like Cuyahoga County Community College and other workforce training programs. But you know, we said we needed to put some guardrails around the loan program. First of all, we're doing a loan program, not a grant program, because when you do grants, you spend the money once and it goes away. When you do loan programs, you provide access over and over and over again. You know, I come from the school that says it's better to teach a man to fish than it is to give him a fish every single day. And that's this program. But here's another guardrail we put on that program. And this is where I think people are thinking outside the box. We said if you will partner, we'll give priority to funding your program if you will partner with the business community. And if you ask the business community to partner with your students, their future employees. If they will do a loan repayment program as part of that, not only do we assure that we're putting people into jobs that employers want them in, but we're also putting a program that makes it accessible for those people who are underemployed. You know, those people who are working somewhere now, but they don't have the job that they really want because they need that extra level of skills. In Ohio, we have a pretty good system of helping people who are unemployed get job training. We don't have such a good system that helps people who are underemployed get job training, because those people need access not only to the tuition to pay the fees, but they need access to child care, or they might need access to another set of benefits. You know, the ones to go from $10 an hour to, in the case of the employers I was talking about, $19 or $20 an hour. Those are big changes with a little bit of investment. And that's why Senate Bill 1, our Workforce Revolving Loan Fund, is targeting that. And the programs that have those linkages with employers and repayment programs are the ones that are going to get the priority funding. Again, we're trying to think outside the box, and if you've got other ideas for us, let us know, because I'll tell you, those 6 employers sitting around my conference table, they had a lot of ideas about what work in West Central Ohio. And some of those things will work here in Northeast Ohio, some may not. We need to hear from you directly. So talk to Tom Patton, talk to Larry Obhoff, talk to Senator Eklund. Yes, sir.
Senator, again, thank you for being here today. On the theme of education, is it time, or is the legislature looking at reducing the number of school districts in this state? We're at 611. I know one size doesn't always fit all, but 611 with the funding issues, is it time to look at maybe partnering, collaborating, regionalizing school districts?
Great question. We are currently always looking for efficiencies and economies. And while I'll digress here in just a second and talk to you about some very small school districts which just do a bang-up job that have to be located in West Central Ohio, I believe school consolidation ought to be a local option. And in some cases, we might have districts that are too big, including one that's right around where we're at, that you might get better services by breaking some big districts up. Now, having said that, you ought to have local control and local insight there. But we have made a real change in the way we incentivize school efficiency. For example, we're allowing districts to share superintendents and treasurers and other administrators to try and get those costs reined in. Particularly in this era where we've done the #1 school building program in the entire country, #1 in Ohio. In that environment, we have built a lot of classroom space, and they're all built on a standard that there's so many square foot to so many kids and teachers. And so that's pretty much there. So the administrative cost that you're going to save isn't putting more teachers or more kids into one teacher's classroom or more teachers into a smaller space. You really will save the money on the administrative side. But let me just give you some examples. There are some very small school districts in my neck of the woods that educate kids at far below the state average. And we're talking about 98, 99, 100% graduation rates. And we're talking about situations to where whatever measure you give them on the state grade card, they hit the cover off the ball. Excellent with distinction. Those school districts, just because they're small, probably don't need to consolidate. They're doing a pretty good job. They're spending less than the state average. The corollary is the opposite in some cases. I've also got in my district some larger school districts, okay, that aren't doing quite so well on the efficiency standpoint. So size alone doesn't always tell you whether they're going to be efficient and be successful. And so you have to be careful assuming one size fits all. But we should have a way that allows districts to consolidate when it makes sense, to share administrators in other cases when that makes sense, and frankly sometimes split up when you've gotten too big that you're not getting the efficiencies you need. So to answer your question is yes to all of it. Yes.
Welcome to Cleveland. Thank you for coming in. Speaking of changing district lines may be appropriate, although perhaps a little bit off the topic of the budget, but there was a lot of attention and concern about our redistricting process just recently, and it won't be long before we'll be facing it again. In between those times, is the Senate going to be looking at reforming the process of redistricting and reapportionment in Ohio?
Absolutely. The Senate has now introduced what we passed at the end of the last General Assembly, our redistricting reform. And the hallmark of this is frankly, the time to do it is now when nobody knows who's going to control the pen in the next redistricting reapportionment period. What our proposal does is requires bipartisan cooperation in the development of district lines. You could never, I said this when we went through this when it was on the ballot last year, you can never take politics out of an inherently political process. You can't. And so the best way to deal with that is to make it transparent and make both sides have to agree on the outcome. And so that's what our proposal in the Senate does. We're going to start having hearings on that next week, actually this week I believe. And we're going to start moving the process forward. The House would like the redistricting proposal to go through the Constitutional Modernization Commission, which frankly has been operating at a glacial pace. And that might be a little faster than it actually is operating. And so I'm curious and concerned that if we delay this too long, the chance of getting meaningful redistricting reform starts to go away. And so from that perspective, we're going to continue the process in the Senate and hope our colleagues in the House will work with us on it. Yes, sir.
Thanks for coming to Cleveland, Senator Faber. I have a question about on the tax side. I'm familiar a little bit with the proposal that Governor Kasich made regarding the business income exemption. And I know you've been studying that closely, as you mentioned. I know that the typical business person, at least as it was originally structured, would probably only get about a couple $100 a year out of that, which wouldn't really mean much in way of expansion of any kind. I'm wondering if you are looking to reconfigure that and exactly how you would do that or how you would pay for it if you do. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Here is the scenario. Right now, just on existing state revenues, we have about about $1.4 billion in revenue that's above our flat line spending. And the plan from the governor was to take that and put it into a 50% small business income tax cut. And that essentially would reduce their tax rates by half. The House took that proposal and did an across-the-board 7% income tax cut. In the Senate, we favor the small business income tax cut that was proposed by the governor, although we're trying to look at options to where we can do some of both. And the reason for that's pretty simple. While in some cases your numbers are correct because it varies based on how the business is having a good or bad year, on average, small businesses create 70% of the jobs in the state of Ohio. And the focus is to try and grow jobs and strengthen the economy. And from that perspective, we think that that would generate a better return for Ohio from an economic perspective than continuing to give a even smaller across-the-board income tax cut on average, because we believe that the small businesses are the places that are most likely to put that capital back to work, either in doing capital expenditures in their business, or, which by the way would allow more people to be hired than the people that provide the things that you're buying from capital, or in some cases actually having enough that would marginally allow you to make a decision to hire another worker directly in the business. And so those things we believe are better than what we've done. And remember, we just came off of a period to where we did an $800 million, which is about a 4.5% across-the-board tax increase in the last budget. And so coming off that period, we thought the best complement to that would probably be the small business income tax cut if we had to pick one. And in that perspective, we think maybe doing some combination will be where we end up. But that's where we're at for now. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Robin Bachman. I'm with the Sisters of Charity Health System, and thanks for coming up to Cleveland. I appreciated your remarks on Medicaid reform. Thank you for that update and the work of the task force. Do you anticipate the state taking action this year on Medicaid reform, including extending coverage?
On Medicaid reform, do I anticipate the state taking action this year? This year, yes. Between now and July 1st, I'm not so sure. We are trying to figure out what reform is. And will it mean the expansion that the governor proposed, or will it mean something else? My guess is it will mean something else. We are working very cooperatively with our friends in the federal government to try and do a waiver that gives Ohio some flexibility in our Medicaid program. A waiver that will allow us to cover more people at less cost, and to try and do things that are going to bend the cost curve even more than the governor and his administration already has. And in that particular scenario, I can't give you the specifics because, frankly, we don't have the answers right now. But I can tell you in the Senate, we recognize that there is a real need to provide coverage for three distinct classes. That is the individuals with mental health coverage, who have to exceed 138% of income to qualify for the exchanges under the Affordable Care Act and would be benefited by Medicaid reform. Individuals with substance abuse problems, which again would have to have incomes that exceed 138% of poverty before they would get benefits under the Affordable Care Act. And then the donut hole individuals are people who have disabilities, because currently they're eligible for Medicaid if their incomes are below 68% of the federal poverty level, and they will have coverage under the Affordable Care Act's healthcare exchanges at 138% of coverage. So it's those individuals between 68 and 138% that have a disability. So those are the three populations that are most impacted by Medicaid expansion. Now the fourth is unemployed or individuals who are single, do not have dependents, and who earn less than 138% of poverty. We throw percentages around, but let's just talk about real numbers. For your benchmark number, 138% of the federal poverty level is $15,400 or thereabouts. That's what the Medicaid folks tell me. That means that somebody who earns less than 138% of poverty earns less than $15,400 a year. That means they are not working full-time at a state minimum wage job. Okay, that's what the numbers mean. And so again, you can understand that with mental health, you can understand that with substance abuse, and you can understand that with a disability. The rest of the story is where we want some reform. And there are other things that we're looking at in reform, like finding a medical home, things that are going to bend and control costs. And so all those are discussions that we're having to try and find an outcome for. So hopefully I answered your question without being specific, because we don't know where we're going to land. But those are the factors that we need to consider when we're trying to solve this problem.
Senator, excuse
Yes,
me.
ma'am.
If I could take us way off track for just a minute.
Okay.
Obviously, recently in Northeast Ohio, in the news, there's been a lot of discussion about the 3 girls who were found on the west side of Cleveland. But violence in this region and across our country has become a serious issue. And there have been local suggestions that we have armed guards in every school and things of that nature. Can you talk a little bit about if the Ohio government is looking at any possible gun changes to getting a gun, to regulation around gun laws and rules? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I'm not sure where you wanted me to go in the question, but let's first talk about the terrible tragedy that was here in Cleveland just not too long ago. And that really wasn't a gun-related issue. I'm very, very proud to look back at my colleagues when we passed the Unborn Infant Protection Act, which makes it a essentially murder to kill an unborn child. In that case, that may be related to that incident, and that may allow the sanctions appropriate for that. We've also worked very diligently on human trafficking issues, and while this does not appear to be human trafficking, it does appear to be kidnapping. I think the two can be somewhat related. And we passed one of the nation's toughest human trafficking laws last session, and we continue to work on that issue. But my heart and prayers, and the heart and prayers of the entire Senate, go out to the families and the 3 girls. We wish them a speedy and recovery, and hopefully they have access to the services they need. And while we're all looking and going to watch the outcome of that very carefully, it sounds like some of the things we did in the past on our criminal justice system worked. Now, on the gun issue, we are all very concerned about the safety of schools. As I mentioned, I've got a 2nd grader and a kindergartner who are about to be 1st graders and 3rd graders. And every day, my most precious family members and things I think about every single minute are going to schools to where I want to make sure my kids are safe. And so we empowered Frank LaRose and Senator Lehner, 2 senators, our public safety and our education, to work on a set of school safety hearings to come up with school safety plans. And they're working on that. And we've had some really good discussions. And one of the things we learned from that discussion is it doesn't seem to be so much about the gun issues, because bad guys will get guns. It has more to do with mental health, it has to do with recognition, and it has to do with how you deal with a problem when it arises. And so that's where we're spending our emphasis and our efforts. And on the school safety issue, I can tell you we will continue to work that through. And Senator Eklund's here who represents Chardon. And we don't need another school disaster. And from that regard, we want to make sure the schools are safe and that we have all the resources that are necessary to keep them safe. And so hopefully I answered your question. But specifically on more gun laws, we've got gun laws in this state. And frankly, we have very strict gun laws when people use guns to commit a crime or use them inappropriately. And from that perspective, we'll continue to keep an eye on these issues.
I now have a budget-related question.
Oh, good.
Can you talk a little bit about, I know, it's gone through the budget proposal's gone through the House and gone through some changes, and now it's in the Senate and will likely go through some changes. Can you talk a little bit about the process of it going back into committee of the two, and where you see that going?
Sure. The budget process is the governor introduces the budget in late February. The House works on it, passes their bill out. That bill comes over to the Senate. The Senate works on it and passes its bill out, and then it goes to what's called conference committee. And the conference committee, we try and work out the differences. Now, technically, conference committee can consider anything that would make it more likely to get both chambers to vote on the bill. But that process is usually about 2 or 3 weeks, where we discuss the areas that are different between the 2 chambers. And in the end, we come back with a bill that can go to the governor's desk before July 1st, when it has to be signed and voted into law. But the conference committee process essentially is a negotiation between the House and the Senate as to what things we want in the final version. And don't forget, the governor also has that eraser called his veto, and he gets a line item veto where he can literally go in and take out words he doesn't like on the lines. So it's much more discretion for the governor than the president has. The president has to either say yes or no to the entire bill. The governor can say yes or no to an entire word. So.
Hi, Senator. One question I have in regards to the budget is one of the major expenditures is always going to be more of the entitlement programs, and you mentioned more of the Medicare and Medicaid aspect. Right. When it comes to kind of the demographic shift, where we have people that are going to live a lot longer than they ever have been, we have all the boomers entering retirement, and probably the lowest interest rate we've ever seen. When it comes to the pension plan liabilities and the unfunded liabilities, right, how is the health of our pension plan system in Ohio, and what are we doing to shore that up?
Ohio's pension plans are I don't want to say strong, but they're much better than most states. And that comes from 2 very important reasons. One, we've always funded our pension plans. We never skip pension funding. Governor Strickland suggested doing that, and it lasted for like 2 seconds. Even people in his own party said that's a terrible idea. And for that reason, Ohio's pension plan is stronger. Because of changes that happen primarily by people living longer and the returns not being so good in the past few years, Ohio's pension plans had to be modified. And we just went through a system of bipartisan pension reforms to address those issues at the end of last session. And so what we did was, frankly, increase the retirement ages and decrease the benefits in some cases for people who have yet to retire. People who are already retired or approaching retirement, we kept those promises for them, for the most part. And so that's where Ohio is. Now, by contrast, there are some states that are underfunded to the tunes of billions and billions of dollars. For the most part, our pension plans are solid. Now, there may be a little ground for discussion on a couple of our plans that seem to be out of balance structurally. We require our plans to have a 30-year funding stream, anticipate that the revenue over the next 30 years will yield the amount of the benefits. And that all of our plans but two are within. And so they'll come back, and we'll ask them to come up with new plans to try and get within that time period. And so that's where we're at. Thank you.
Thank you. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to Senator Keith Faber, President of the Ohio Senate. We thank all of you, guests as well as members, for being here today. Thank you, Senator Faber. Thank you to IdeaStream. This forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
PNC is proud to support the presentation of this City Club of Cleveland Friday Forum on WVIZ PBS.
Additional support comes from Cleveland State University. Support for closed caption transcripts of City Club forums is provided by the Nordson Corporation Foundation.